Hello, everyone. Welcome to Designing Science, the IndieBio podcast. I'm Arvind Gupta, your host and the founder of IndieBio. I'm here to help share the secrets and tales from the frontiers of biotechnology. IndieBio enables the world's best scientists to build radically innovative companies. This podcast is for you. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to have you join us for another episode of Designing Science with IndieBio. I'm the founder of IndieBio, Arvind Gupta, and with me today is the esteemed Steve Blank, the father of Lean Startup, and in many ways kickstarted this whole idea of building startups in the way we do today in the last 15 years. It's what inspired me to do my own startup. It inspired millions of others to do their startups and has helped a lot of people find product market fit and fail much faster to succeed in the long run. And so what's been amazing to watch for me is how Steve has started to go into and take that approach and go into biotech in the same exact way we were inspired to at IndieBio. And so Steve is a founder of 8 different startups. For 21 years, he's been an entrepreneur. He's the architect of the NIH I-Core class, which has launched many biotech startups. And it's now the standard for commercialization and federal research. So I don't think there's a better person on the planet to talk about how do we speed up biology and commercialization of biology in product design. So please, I'm really excited to have you. Thank you so much for your time, Steve.
Thanks for having me. You know, it doesn't get better than that intro, so I'll leave now.
Oh, absolutely. So, you know, I'd love to hear how you even got to this idea of a lean startup. I mean, back in the day, especially in biotech, we're talking, you don't start a company without hundreds of millions of dollars, you know, tens of millions of dollars is lean, you know,
right.
Hundreds of millions of dollars is normal. And the idea of a startup doing it in the first place was a very difficult one to even grasp. And likewise in IT and tech circles, what made you think this was even remotely possible?
It's a great question. And I'll get to the bio side first, but as you mentioned, my first career was as a serial entrepreneur in tech and IT. And that was in the 20th century. And believe it or not, in the 20th century, how we built startups, we had a great tech idea. You know, we wrote a business plan, you know, 50, 100 pages. It had Appendix A, which was a 5-year forecast, had $100 million, had a, you know,
right.
revenue plan, cash flow, balance sheet, income statement, and then a hiring plan, and then an engineering plan. And if we were very good, we translated that plan into 10 or 12 slides, and if we were even better and used the right hand gestures and font and used a deep voice, we were able to get VCs to kind of fund the plan. And here's basically how it worked. We would get the plan funded, and we'd start hiring to the plan. And we'd start building the product, whether it was hardware or software or biotech, life sciences, or devices or diagnostics or anything, because the plan said so, and we were funded to the plan. What we didn't realize is we were just executing a plan, assuming we had everything known. That is, everything we wrote down must be a fact. And if you think about it, the reason why we did that is that's what large companies did. But we never noticed that large companies wrote plans for second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th products because they were already large. Right. They knew who their customers were, they knew their channels, they knew, most importantly, what features those customers wanted, we knew the competition, we knew pricing. We have a series of knowns when we write plans for next products in large corporations. And so our investors, who historically, at least back then, weren't entrepreneurs, mostly finance and MBAs, said, well, this is how large companies did. Start up, go write the plan and execute the plan. And by the way, what would happen back then is you would like spend a year or 2, or if it was life sciences, 5 or 10, building a product or service or something, and you know, you'd have a revenue plan, you'd get the first customer ship, and you'd ship the product, everybody be high-fiving the VP of marketing, the first, you know, board meeting, and next board meeting, you'd turn to the VP of sales and say, how you doing? And he, and back then it was he, would say, great pipeline. Great pipeline, actually, for those of you who don't know what it means no, we're not quite meeting the revenue plan, but don't worry, it's going to be good. And that conversation will repeat every 6 weeks in multiple board meetings, and depending on the economic climate, at one point the board members would arch one eyebrow to the CEO, and who would look at the VP of sales, and the next board meeting, poof, there'd just be a puff of smoke and a pile of ashes, and a new VP of sales would appear. And this would repeat until you either run out of cash, or the new VP of sales, who wasn't making their numbers either, would say, it's a marketing problem. And then you'd end up firing the VP of marketing. And then that would continue, and if it didn't work, you'd fire the CEO, depending on their role, might become the chief technical officer, chairman of the board. What was really interesting in the 20th century of the story is every time you fired an exec, because obviously there was nothing wrong with the plan. It's a big idea. The plan was inviolate. The VCs gave you money to fund the plan. And if you were failing, it was a personnel problem. But guess what? That new VP of sales who came in, he didn't execute the last plan, because obviously that's what got his predecessor fired. So he changed, but never quite said he was changing strategy. He would do something now we would call a pivot. But pivots back then only happened when you fired people.
Right.
And then the new VP of marketing would come in and say, well, that was a dumb marketing strategy. We obviously need to position the company. It was actually a pivot, but we didn't pivot until we fired people as we're burning cash way into the future. The reason I tell you the how did it work story is that when I retired after 8 startups in 21 years, for the first time, I actually got to get my head up. Remember, if you're a great entrepreneur, you're not looking at the state of the industry or the whole world of your head's down doing your company and deal, and maybe your aperture is wide enough for your domain. But I finally got time to think about the nature of innovation entrepreneurship. And what I realized, to finally answer your question, was large companies execute known business models, but startups should be searching for business models. And this distinction between search and execution had never been articulated before. We were operating startups like we had a series of known facts, so therefore all we needed to do was execute our plan like these were knowns. When instead we were actually talking about a series of unknowns, but had no methodology at all to kind of test them, even describe them. So what was your question?
Interesting. So that's what led to the idea of
Lean Startup.
And Lean Startup became that methodology of testing those assumptions.
Lean Startup was actually built in a series of pieces. So once I had this idea that, well, wait a minute, God didn't write our plan, and in fact, all we have is a set of untested hypotheses, which is a fancy word for we were just effing guessing. And we were all guessing. Yeah. And my experience is what we used to do was argue in planning meetings inside the building who had the right idea. No, we need this feature. No, it ought to be green, or no, it ought to be whatever, or no, we ought to price it like this. And we were just talking to each other. And the light bulb went on for me, just based on my past experiences. What became a key tenet of Lean is there are no facts inside the building, so get the hell outside. And the corollary to that is, while you might be the smartest people in the building, there's no way you're smarter than the collective intelligence of your potential customers.
Right.
Whoa. But we had no formal methodology for getting outside and going, well, what are we testing? Who are we testing it with? How are we testing? What are the questions we're asking? What hypotheses are really critical on day one? Because if you're a techie like I was, and all the startups I had done were tech and science-based, you assumed, and I assumed for decades, is that, well, if you have a great technical idea, obviously the company part is easy. Right. You hire some fancy guy with gold chains and a fancy watch, and that's sales somewhere, and somehow this thing called marketing, I don't even know what it did. They wrote things and they kind of described the product. I had to yell at them. It didn't quite match, but it was big words. That's marketing. But gee, as the technical inventor, how hard could this be? Well, it turns out that your idea is only the small part of the company. Sure. It's all the rest of the stuff that surrounds it that turns it from a technical idea into a profitable venture. Right. And as a technologist or a scientist and engineer, you need to understand what are all these pieces. And so So the first book I wrote, called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, which other people have said kind of kick-started the lean startup movement, talked about the first part of the 3 parts of lean, and that was called customer development. It talked about how do you get out of the building, what should you be asking about, et cetera. The next part happened when one of my students, in fact, I invested in his company, we ran the experiments for the first part of lean, named Eric Ries, who Eric observed as Steve, in the 21st century, there's a methodology for building products that are very different in the 20th. In the 20th century, we built products serially, that is, kind of as a step at a time, and only found out whether we were wrong at the end. It was called waterfall engineering. Whether it's true in hardware or software or life sciences, et cetera. You kind of just build the product and then you ship it. You alpha test, beta test, first customer ship. But Eric observed that, at least in the 21st century, no, we have a methodology to build products iteratively and incrementally. And that created an interesting opportunity, is not only can we go out and talk to customers about their needs and pricing or whatever, we can actually show them something called minimum viable products. We could show them, I used to call it minimum feature sets, Eric's name was much better, and more importantly, when we discovered that some of our hypotheses were wrong, instead of waiting to fire an executive, here's a big idea, the whole key idea of lean, we get to fire some of our hypotheses. Meaning, we get to fire part of the plan, where never before in the history of startups would you ever question what your assumptions were on day one. Obviously, we got money. Obviously, we're smart. The 21st century says, no, we're just guessing, maybe we ought to validate. And in fact, for scientists and engineers, I remind them, let's assume all your science is 100% correct. We're not going to question that. But tell me about regulation and reimbursement and clinical trials and customers and pricing and so why don't we just test some of those things and make sure we understand. And the third piece of lean, so there was customer development, agile engineering, and the third piece of lean came from Alexander Osterwalder, who came up with a single piece of paper called the business model canvas. And the business model canvas said, look, there are lots of moving parts in a startup and lots of things you need to worry about your technology and whatever, but here's a single piece of paper that says, if you worry about these 9 boxes, you'll be worrying about the things that matter to turn your idea into money. And those things are, who are your customers, right? And there's going to be multiple of them we could discuss later. What are you building for them? Well, I'm building whatever they're, no. What do they want? What will they pay for? More importantly, what will they grab out of your hands now or later? How are you going to get it to them? Is it direct sales? Is it, a web app? Is it sold through other people? Do you have a deal with Genentech and your license? And then falling out of that is, what's the revenue model? Is it a licensing deal? Is it, is it a pay? Is it something else? Is it IP? And then how are you going to keep and grow customers? And for biotech, that's kind of interesting, because that means who are the key opinion leaders, what's your scientific advisory board, where you're being published, what conferences are you speaking in, et cetera. How do you gain both credibility and customers? And if you're a consumer version of biotech, let's say you're making artificial food or something, gee, now I got both, I need to attract scientific kind of credibility, but I also need to create demand on the end user side by building a brand. Holy cow. And then I need to worry about, what activities do I need to do? Do I need to have a lab? Can I outsource that, et cetera? What resources do I need internally? And what partners can I take some of this stuff outside? I'm not going to be building clinical trials myself if that's what I'm doing. So what kind of partners do I need? And then what are my costs? And that's what the business model canvas talks about. When you put all 3 of those together, business model canvas, customer development, and agile engineering, that's what we call the lean startup. And the cover of the May 2013 Harvard Business Review kind of made that legal for not only startups, but for large companies. It said why the lean startup changes everything. And then I'll tell you the next story when you ask is, but how did it end up in life sciences?
No, what, it just it sparked in my mind as you're telling the story. This is also what got VCs excited about investing in founders. As opposed to investing in business plans.
So it's a great insight. So it's hard to believe in the 20th century, here's the role of founders, right, for VCs. So VCs love founders because, remember, a VC is nothing more than a financial asset class. They make money when there's what's called a liquidity event. A liquidity event is a fancy finance term for Did we sell your company to somebody else, and did we make more from that sale than we gave you? Or did we go public, that is on a stock market, where now the stock I own is now publicly traded at some value that's incrementally, hopefully, going up rather than down. But in either case, VCs, that's why they gave you money. But in the 20th century, they would understand that don't worry your little head about the rest of the business model. We'll hire MBAs and professional people to go do that.
Right.
You founders over here, you just build the product, and when times to scale sales and marketing and whatever, we'll bring in the professional management.
Right.
Almost always. And by the way, that worked because all you had to do is build one product, and that one product cycle could last through a liquidity event. That is, it was good enough to get you sold, it was good enough to get you public, and because we would bring in that suit, who didn't know any of the tech or innovation, but they could manage your invention to scale.
Right.
For not all products, but certainly in tech now, and a good chunk of bio and life sciences, is that the rate of change that's required to stay in business requires the founders there long enough to generate a series of innovations, not just one. And if you get rid of the founder too early, your investors aren't left with anything.
Right.
So starting in the 21st century, at least in tech, Mark Andreessen at a firm called Andreessen Horowitz had the idea that says, no, the real value is keeping the founders as the CEO, and we could train them on some of the key business components that they ought to need to know rather than firing them early. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And at least on tech and IP side, and certainly in bio, we've generated hundreds of unicorns since we changed this mindset. A unicorn is defined as a company with a market valuation of more than $1 billion.
Right.
If you really think about it, this idea of keeping founders in place has been a lot more profitable than getting rid of the founders or pushing them aside. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is, of course, it's led to, if you've never run a company at scale, all kinds of bad behaviors that might have been beaten out of you by professional management who said, no, you can't sleep with all those secretaries, or no, you can't be spending this money in Las Vegas and whatever. Right. You do get visible outliers where the behavior had no role models, right? And what's worse is that if you're a hot startup and now you're the founding CEO, you now kind of control the board. Yes. So the behaviors that used to be mediated by your VCs threatening to fire you have also gone away, because now the good news for founders in the 21st century is you have a lot more control than you had in the 20th. The bad news is any bad behavior you might have had, which was small, is now magnified at scale.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, so this happened in tech, and yes, hundreds of unicorns have been created. And that was the fundamental insight of Indie Bio, actually.
There you go.
This hasn't happened at scale in biology.
It will. And you guys are, I agree with you guys in this notion of, wait a minute, this is a teachable set of activities. Yes. In fact, you at Indie Bio had the same insight that UCSF and NIH had. Yes. It's, when I wrote the 4 Steps to the Epiphany, I was talking about customer development and thinking about scale. I said this will work for everything but life sciences.
You said but life sciences.
But life sciences. It obviously won't work for life sciences because my model was the 20th century version of life sciences. You had some invention in a lab, and you're a scientist, and you kind of raised a ton of money, but you didn't find out whether there was an outcome until way later, until you're finally in FDA phase 1, and then maybe 2, and then maybe you get acquired, but it took 10 years.
Right.
And there was no possible way to know whether you were successful or not, or whether you're going to even be acquired. And that might have been true at some corner cases, actually, in the 20th century. But UCSF said, Steve, no. This whole lean startup stuff, the stuff you're now teaching at Stanford, that is, I took the 3 pieces of lean and created a course at Stanford, which is still taught after, 10 years, called the Lean Launchpad, which had become adopted by the National Science Foundation for commercializing all the tech that the NSF funded. So, material science, computer science, robotics, et cetera. The NSF scaled it up to a class called I-Core for the Innovation Core. And it's now taught in 81 universities. But it was just NSF funded research. But UCSF saw it and said, Steve, no, this will work for devices and diagnostics and even therapeutics and this emerging thing back then called digital health.
Right.
And I went, no. Listen, I wrote the book. This won't work. And they said, Steve, we know something about life sciences.
Right.
We have the same problems here. And so we built a prototype we built the class, not just a prototype, at UCSF, and Carl Handelman for taught therapeutics, and
Wonderful guy.
and Alan May for devices, and a bunch of other folks on digital health and diagnostics, and very smart people who knew the domains. But so we modified the standard class to kind of take into account the vagaries of each one of those specific domains about what's different about diagnostics versus therapeutics versus devices for a business model. And by week 4, the NIH came out and said, we need this for our institutes, right? And so I think now 2 or maybe 4 of the 17 NIH divisions now teach I-Core at the NIH. And basically the idea is, look, let's assume that your technology is spectacular, but that doesn't mean you're going to have some liquidity event or even attract investors. What are the other things, if you're a scientist and engineer, you need to know? Gee, if you're in the lab, the odds that you know about regulation or reimbursement or any of those things, unless you've done it before or seen somebody else do it before, that's not part of your science.
Right.
So 1 or 2 things are going to be happening. You could either be the co-founder and the chief scientist and be dependent on some guy with a gold chain and fancy watch and say, well, yeah, I guess the salesperson knows more, we're biz dev. Or you could actually learn the pieces yourself, not because I want you to change jobs, but unless you know all the components of commercialization, you're always going to be beholden to other people in your company without you being able to affect the strategy. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely central to what we think about at IndyBio.
Yeah, you teach this all the time.
We teach it, and we believe you get much better outcomes both as founders, in terms of your liquidity event.
Right.
You're much more likely to get to unicorn, but also you're much more likely to build a business that produces real value.
Right.
And so one of the things that you mentioned earlier that we see like night and day between the teams that actually go out and do it and the ones that don't, is the answers aren't in the room.
Right.
You got to get out. So how do you in your classes and in your experience, how do you get scientists who find the answers in the room to go out of the room? So
a couple things. And you're finding this yourself. This is a horse and jockey problem. You've seen horses in a pasture, they're not running their ass off on a track.
Right.
Why? The grass is great, I'm happy and whatever. Right. You stick a jockey on them and you hit them a lot with a stick.
Yes.
And the stick for the NSF and the NIH was funding. So at the NSF, you can't get an SBIR grant today if you're a principal investigator, without taking some version of this class. Not for a basic research grant, but if you want to, if you raise your hand and say, I want to commercialize my stuff, in the past, for the last 30 years, at least at the NSF, they were giving out cars without requiring driver's ed.
Right.
And surprised that they were crashing, right? So that is, the analogy is, for most people, this get out of the building stuff, especially because of who we're teaching, right? These are some of the smartest people in the world, right?
Absolutely.
In IndyBio and an NIH and whatever. So customer development isn't a technical problem they can't solve, but it's a cultural and emotional problem. And I have found that the instinct to get out of the building is inversely proportional to how smart you are.
Yes.
Meaning the smarter you are, the more you think that, well, listen, I understand the problem. I understand the customers. All we need to do is build the solution. Right. That is the product or service or whatever. Don't get in my way. I'm really excited about building this thing. So just, thanks for your incubator. Where's the lab so I could get to work? Without understanding yes, you might build the perfect product that no one wants. Right? Or can't be cleared, or can't create demand or whatever. And so to answer your question, it either has to be self-selection, that someone is smart enough to realize, oh, there are other pieces that make up a company, right? Or 2, oh, it's the only way I'm going to get money, right? Right? Or 3 is, you know what? I never want to be the CEO or whatever, but yeah, I do want to know what these other pieces are because my time is valuable as a researcher. So if you think about it, for the NSF and NIH, these principal investigators are not going to leave their academic jobs and become, most of them don't, some small percentage do. They might become chief science officers or take a sabbatical or whatever. But the fact is that they will tell you, and the NSF tracks this longitudinally, that it changed their entire careers and outlook of commercialization of how they teach their next generation of students. It's like, it's changed the entire trajectory of science, at least for NSF-funded science, because now the PIs understand what sales is, right? What a customer is, what product market fit is. And so if you're a scientist and engineer, why I would want to go through IndieBio is, no, let's agree your science is genius, but your science is not a company.
That's right.
And, like, a liquidity event. So, the learning from me, great example from Alan May. It might still be true, but the thing I learned is, Steve, no device company goes public. They're all acquisitions. Well, wait a minute. If they're all acquisitions, you time your investments and the trials and whatever. That is, there are different steps of how much money you raise to what your goals are to when you get acquired. Well, if I'm a device scientist, I didn't even ever consider that was a thing, right? Now all of a sudden, the fact that I know that makes me much smarter in who do I hire, what time, how much money do I go for, what I'm looking for in investors. Do they not only get the science, but do they get the goal is liquidity? Because you got to remember, as a founder, which is different than an employee, as a founder, you're participating in a giant Ponzi scheme in a very nice way. Is no one's funding you because they like you. They might like you. In fact, it's usually a criteria, but they're funding you because they're thinking if they put $1 in, they're going to get $10 out.
That's right.
And so the other thing I teach founders is, if you don't understand the people who are financing you's business model, you're going to be screwed. That is, you need to understand, how do they make money? Right? Gee, I just found somebody who will pay me 2x what you invested. The shocker for most founders are the VCs will go, no, we'd rather run it into the ground.
That's right.
Right? Well, why? Well, it'll make my numbers look bad. I'd rather, no, we're holding out for 10 or 20x, and you're thinking I get to go home, I can make 2x. And your VCs are going, if you don't understand that math, also as a founder, your interest and your investor's interest are what I call aligned for the first year or two. And then unless you're tracking what they're looking for, they could be becoming unaligned, and you could become the ex-CEO or ex-founder who's sitting in the parking lot looking in. I'm sorry, I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a really important thing to remember is what you're saying really is, as a founder, not only do you have to know your core technology, but you got to know all the pieces of how that's going to deliver not only value to the customer, but value to the investors. Yes.
And you're going, I thought I was just joining IndieBio to get some demo out. And the answer is yes, but this allows you to play chess versus checkers. Also, going through something like IndieBio helps you kind of self-identify of, are you the innovator or are you the entrepreneur?
I like this. Yeah.
And you could be both, but
explain that a little bit. The innovator versus the entrepreneur.
It dawned on me. The innovator is usually the principal investigator or some great postdoc, or it could be anybody, but it's usually somebody who wrote the paper or has the idea, or basically is the person with the insight about something.
Right.
The entrepreneur may be that person, but it's often somebody just completely different who gets that idea and is able to go through walls with it. It's Gates versus Allen. It's Wozniak versus Jobs. It's Elon Musk versus J.B. Straubel. That is, the people we kind of forget were the people who actually built the stuff. But the entrepreneur was the person who made the object look larger than life and was able to create a reality distortion field to attract people and money and customers and all the other stuff where it was irrational to give you money or quit my job and join this thing or to buy it before when it was buggy unfinished. That's the job of the entrepreneur. And at minimum, every startup requires those two skill sets. As I said, rarely it happens in one. I'm not going to say it doesn't, but it doesn't mean you have to be both. Most of the times you're not. But it is important to look around and say, well, if I'm the innovator, who's the entrepreneur? And it doesn't mean you need one on day one, but to be a successful company and to compete with your peers, you're going to need a crazy person. And that was typically my role in startups. Is that
I can see that.
I was capable of explaining very complicated technique. I did 2 semiconductor companies, supercomputers, and whatever. And my role was to be able to explain them to my mother, who didn't even speak English as a first language. So if I could do that, right, then I had a shot at explaining things to customers and buyers and whatever. Does that make sense at all?
Absolutely.
And so when you're going through an accelerator or thinking about starting a company, part of this early team, the founding team, is you ought to look at the business model canvas, number one, and say, for all those activities I think I need to be expert in, is that part of my founding team?
Yeah.
Right? And then two is, who's the entrepreneur? Who's the one that's going to make this happen?
Yeah.
Now, later on, as you get successful, you kind of need the person who could scale.
Okay.
Sometimes that's the entrepreneur, but sometimes that's someone you bring in as well.
Right.
The Sheryl Sandbergs or the Eric Schmidts or the whatever. As I said, in the past, they used to replace the CEO. Now they could be the backstops to the CEO.
That's right.
Well, what do you do when you go past 20 people or 100 or, if you're lucky enough, thousands of people?
That's right. And as we go into life sciences, and as life sciences, the tools are getting faster and faster, and the tools are getting cheaper and cheaper. So science can be conducted in a way that looks much more like IT than ever before. And you're an early investor in Ginkgo Bioworks as well, and so you've seen it firsthand.
Right.
And
things like CRISPR and Cas9 are just changing the entire world of their drug design.
Absolutely. And so, I guess one of the things I'm wondering about is how do I'm a scientist. I'm an innovator with an idea. What have you seen is the best way for them to burst out of their bench and create a company, attract dollars? Is there a game plan that you've seen that works better than others, or something, or is it different for everyone?
So it's different for everyone, and I'm gonna do a shameless plug for IndieBio, but no. IndieBio is like Y Combinator for biotech, life sciences, and the rest.
I don't mind the comparison.
I'm sorry?
I don't mind the comparison. I like it very much.
But the comparison, all right, now I'll just take it a little back.
I'm teasing you.
But the category of having an accelerator, that is, if you think about what Y Combinator did, it taught basic blocking and tackling techniques for A, to find product market fit, and B, the other part we didn't talk about, but you guys do well, is, so how do you talk to the money, right?
That's right.
How do you explain to someone, like you're talking to your mother, this time even somebody dumber, investors who you think you're convinced they want to know all about your science, and you're teaching them, no, they want to know how they're going to make a ton of money, right? Which is a very different interpretation. And, if we use lean, it's not that we have to tell them about the 100 or so customers, but now we could take everything we've been doing in IndieBio and other places and just turn it into evidence-based entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
And now you could propose to potential investors, well, here's the evidence we've collected to date.
That's right.
Holy cow. You're turning a faith-based organization into a fact-based organization.
Right.
That is something from a religious thing.
You nailed it, right? That fact-based is what's so critical, and it's not just facts in the lab, but it's facts with customers and facts with, and that's
so every time you gather facts and evidence, you reduce risk.
That's right.
Right, and if you're an investor, right, I'm calculating how much of this crazy idea, if it works, would return, but what's the risk reward? And now you're telling me, here's how you're approaching risk, and if you have that, in fact, one of this whole reason this lean stuff works is what I was too embarrassed to say it, but the NSF has said, Steve, you invented the scientific method for entrepreneurship. And I never would.
It's
Okay,
a really
yeah,
good way to put
right.
it. Yeah.
It's
No,
evidence-based.
it's
It's
a great
right.
way to put it.
We start with hypotheses, right? We design experiments.
Yeah.
We get out of the building. We, run the experiment, get some data, get some insight, and then do three things: modify the hypothesis, invalidate the hypothesis, or validate it,
Yeah.
and then go through the loop again with different hypotheses. People invented lean 500 years ago, right?
Sure.
It was a scientific method, and we ran it on science.
Sure.
Now we could run it on something a little more complicated of all the moving parts in a business model, which, by the way, all lean does is solve what in computer science you would call an NP-complete problem, which is computational unsolvable.
Right.
And now you're putting a bounding box around all the permutations and say, the odds are you probably have to deal with regulatory stuff. The odds are you might have to run a clinical trial. So what do you need to know? The odds are, you're going to need to be reimbursed. So how are you going to code it? How's it going to get paid? How, I don't know, I just invented this device. And so go back again is IndieBio and others like you are going to take scientists and researchers out of the lab and give them a halfway house, right? That skills them up about the parts of the stuff about business they don't know. Let's assume your science is genius, right? But let's assume you may not know this other stuff, and that should be the test. In fact, when I run through these people at the NSF and other government agencies, there's 5% of scientists who know way more than what we're going to teach them, who instinctually know how to kind of schmooze, Roche or they have friends at Merck or, they're in J&J already and they got buddies there. You know what? You probably don't need this, right? But if you're not that person, but you've been looking at that person going, how did that work? This is teachable, right? Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the reason that IndieBio is my life's work is the result is more cures.
Right.
The result is, better solutions for planetary problems of global warming and things like that only biology can solve. So, I'm personally thankful for the methodology that you've been contributing to get these types of technologies out there.
Yeah, but you guys are going to make it not only better, but more targeted and focused for your audiences, right? Because you're living it every day, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't know. This is like 21 years. Well, how would it work? That's been one of the enjoyable things about watching this kind of take off. It was like I was solving a problem for me, and I didn't really care at the time because I was retired, whether anybody else. And it's neat to see places like IndieBio and your insights and others building on top of. It's not only are we not done with lean, we're barely started, right?
That's a good way to put it.
And if it still looks like it did 10 years ago, there's something wrong. So the value add that you will bring for diagnostics or devices or synthetic biology or digital health or whatever will just make this immensely more valuable for the teams that go through, because you could say, well, let me tell you the 15 ways we've seen companies fail. Here's the part of the business model we want you to test, or here are the people we need you to go talk to.
Right.
And you guys have such a world-class Rolodex of people they should talk to, or traps that investors want to go have answers for before they show up at demo day. I just think, to answer your original question, I cannot imagine being a scientist and not begging to get into something like IndieBio. It will just increase the value of their time and energy.
Awesome, thank you. So we're about out of time, so I want to ask you one last question. We've talked a lot about lean startup and all of that. You have a huge history and successful past as an investor as well. Where do you mentioned that the Apple Watch is a turning point or tipping point for healthcare?
Potentially.
Where do you see the future of healthcare going?
Yeah, well, if I knew that, I'd make $1 trillion, right? I mean, it's think about it. It's Google has an enormous, Google Ventures enormous portfolio in healthcare, kind of spread around. Amazon is, they just spent $1 billion, basically pharmacy distribution. So like someone over there woke up, let's throw in $1 billion. And Apple, I think, accidentally is backing into, the first version of the Apple Watch, I kind of said, was there to sell watch bands, because why else did you need it?
Right.
Fitbit just did fine. I mean, the second and third generation was more of a fitness and health tracker. But, the fact that they just got 2 FDA-approved apps, ECG and atrial fibrillation, a single lead electrode. It's really kind of interesting, not just because they put a new sensor on, but also because they've been one of the 9 companies working with the FDA to kind of accelerate approvals of medical devices / diagnostics. And I think it's a great experiment for both the FDA, who's trying to, under Gottlieb, who's trying to accelerate this to kind of keep up with the pace of this, the changes. But I think if Apple, and maybe this was always the intent from day one and the capabilities catching up with the vision, but just imagine, somebody cracking the holy grail of the glucose sensor, right? That's been the deathbed of, I don't know, thousands of startups, and maybe billions of dollars.
Yes.
But there's a couple of interesting Apple patents on this, and as my friends remind me in device land, it's not just getting the signal, but correlating it with a condition that actually is worth tracking. But just imagine now getting some of the vital signs. And it's not just, are you sick? Imagine being able to permanently track tens of millions of people between the transition of they were fine to they got sick.
Right.
Whoa. Now all of a sudden you apply some AI to that and machine learning. You can now pick out predictive patterns of here's some signals we've never seen in data of you might be, on the path to X or Y, you might want to get looked at. There's some great research kit data on Parkinson's, prediction and whatever. So I see Apple Watch, and why I picked on the Apple Watch is if you think about it, there's a 64-bit computer, gigs of memory, cellular whatever, Wi-Fi, GPS, accelerometer.
Computer on your wrist.
It's a supercomputer. When I grew up, it was like a room.
Right.
So there's only 5 or 4 companies capable of doing that right now. Philips is probably the only other company that does consumer devices and medical devices. But it just means they're ahead, but it doesn't mean they're going to win. The amount of resource they have on this compared to what they have on the hardware seems infinitesimally unbalanced. Right. But it's a portent of what I think we're going to see in the next 5 years, and certainly in the next 10. And think about how that changes clinicians.
Yes.
So the first thing is we're going to have people panic going in, I have a heart attack or whatever. Right. But then over time, clinicians are going to be used to getting real-time diagnostics from patients, and they're just going to be tracking patients, and they'll be able to push a button and call them saying, hey, you might want to come in.
Yeah, so healthcare becomes home care in many ways.
Yes.
That's a big idea.
And so think about it is right now when you go see a doctor, they get a single data point at a single point of time.
Yeah.
It doesn't take imagination to think about, wait a minute, we have continuous monitoring of billions of people.
Right.
Whoa, for healthcare.
People are trying to do that in other areas too, which is scary.
So I think it's transformational. Yeah. And why I wrote about the Apple Watch is I thought that was just it didn't take much imagination to see 5 or 10 years how it not just changes the device, but changes the entire health to home care device in the role of clinicians.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. I had a great time chatting.
And listen, I think IndieBio is doing God's work for biotech.
Well, I appreciate that. That means a lot to me.
And not only are you designing science, you're designing innovation and entrepreneurship as well. Yes. So congratulations. Great job.
Thank you so much, Steve. Yeah. Pleasure to have you.